I was driving my car, minding my business, much like I did every Sunday. There is a stretch of road not far from where I live, blasting down it at speed, and watching the rolling hills and waves of leaves rush as my car tires hit them. Once upon a time, this was the highlight of my week. Now, it's just an awful memory and flashback that haunts me. One Sunday afternoon, I foolishly decided to take a different route that appealed to me. I took it, and looking back, I wish I hadn't. I went just a little tiny bit too quickly, leading to me spinning out a little. It was also a damp day. The rain had finished pouring from the sky earlier that morning, soaking everything in sight, especially the road, which didn't help in my case. I wasn't as good of a driver as I had initially thought. Even worse was that on the other side of the road there was an oncoming car, which I somehow managed to collide directly into. Unsurprisingly, the man driving the vehicle wasn't happy, as his rather expensive and pristine Ferrari had just been violently dented by my crummy Ford Focus. Being a typical 17-year-old and growing up in southern England, I couldn't do much better, which, from the benefit of hindsight, was a good thing, as if I had been going any faster, I think I would have caused a lot more damage to my vehicle. The man wanted compensation, and he wanted it fast. Thousands and thousands were demanded, but I was far from able to pay, so he had resorted to his other, far worse for me choice. He threatened to summon me to court to sort it out there, seeing as I was too immature and poor to sort this matter out on my own, as he had put it. I knew that he could not legally do this, though, so I stood my ground, scared out of my mind, but undefeated. Nobody dares to me like that. I was more than ready to take him on until it clicked. I had barely any money and no experience, but I needed a skilled and professional lawyer. Despite the damage done by my relatively small Ford Fiesta being minor, the man made a big deal out of it, and for all I knew, it could have escalated into me receiving criminal damage charges. I knew he had one of his friends to aid him, an experienced accident lawyer who could quickly and efficiently rip me to shreds at the click of a finger. And who did that leave me with? Nobody, but then again, I was more than used to this. An orphan like myself is an orphan for a reason, after all. The one thing I had going for me was a high-quality education, and although I knew almost nothing about my area's legal system, I knew that I was more than capable of learning the ins and outs before the court date had been told. Several weeks passed, and he continued to bug me, threatening me with court dates and his evidence folder, and telling me he would wring my already struggling bank account dry. I was terrified of what was to come at first, but by this point I was unfazed, knowing that I had learned quite a bit about the legal system. The anxiety I now faced had kept me from leaving my house for weeks to come, like I was trapped out of my mind as well as in it. So all that was left for me to do was study the traffic and accident laws of my area to increase my chances of success significantly. The anxiety began to fade as I read them over and over, taking down any notes that would help me, and then picking from them what would win this case. Now, all that was left was a little more procrastinating, just a few more weeks left to find my inner lawyer, which was looking more and more likely by the second. I had always been my best friend, so seeing myself through this challenging time and coming out on top was likely. The victory was definitely in my sights. Despite all the stress of the case, I still needed to live an everyday life and maintain a standard of living. But everything was intense and complex. Even a simple trip to the shop led to a spike in anxiety. It was like everyone was looking at me, fixating as I strolled past frantically, trying to pick up my groceries while encountering as few people as possible. How did they even know that I was in a court case. What business was it to them? The day before the court case arrived, I received a phone call to confirm the details. They were surprised I would rather defend myself than have someone do it for me. Surely I would want a free lawyer. No, honestly, I wouldn't. I wanted to prove that I could stand my ground and fight my battles despite my background. The sour and rich older man cackled when he was made aware that I was on my own, but that was his downfall. His wealth clouded his judgment and led to his subsequent humiliation. Before I knew it, the day of the court case arrived, and I was scared. Scared was an extreme understatement of my emotions. The man stood, towering over the podium that he was put upon. He must have been at least 6'5", maybe closer to 7 feet. Now it wasn't just his persona that intimidated me. This giant man would indeed have me beaten physically, but in the court I was pretty confident he would lose to my knowledge. I was prepared and reminded myself of this as we headed into the court and sat at our respective tables, waiting for the judge to walk in. We stood up as he walked in, though I struggled to stand straight as my legs trembled beneath me, and sat down as the case began. The judge presiding was a more prominent man, though he had quite the cruel face, and the jury didn't look much friendlier either. However, I would be fine, and by the end of it, they would surely be on my side, after all the convincing arguments I had prepared for this case. The experienced lawyer stood no chance against me now. I was in my prime now. We argued back and forth, but I was no longer scared. I was empowered. I could now see more clearly the cloud of fear had been lifted. Due to this, I noticed the uproar of the jury whenever he spoke. They were seemingly on my side. As their moods changed, the lawyer the other man had hired began to look less confident and more like he was about to piss himself off as he realized he was losing. Seeing this was like fuel to the burning fire of confidence inside of me, and several times I had to hold back a smile from creeping onto my face. At last it was time. The jury began to file out of the room. One by one, they disappeared, and in 30 minutes they'd be back to tell me if I could have my life before or not. It was time for me to go on a break too. While I waited, but first I got to see the cracked caricature of the man, legs shaking and no eye contact made. He was nervous and doing a terrible job of hiding it from view. It was a sight I enjoyed immensely, very much, quite an amusing thing to see. It lifted my spirits as the anxiety I was feeling made me want to burst into tears, but the happiness helped me hold it back as we waited for recess. The minutes passed slowly. 1,800 seconds felt like 1,800,000. As the jury reconvened in the other room, I could feel my life slip past me. But when they returned, I sat up straighter, waiting anxiously for the verdict of this case. This would determine the rest of my life. I don't know how I could cope if I lost this trial. I waited with intensely bated breath for the judge to speak. His cruel face stared down at me, and he began to talk about my fate. After much debate, the jury and I have come to a mutual conclusion that the defendant is not guilty and that no fees must be paid for the accidental damage inflicted upon the Ferrari by the defendant's car. I had never thought I would win in a million years, but it was like a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I could finally relax after all this time, go out and see my friends without his army of followers harassing me wherever I went. The relief was utterly indescribable, and the joy after, as the judge told me that the man I had crashed into would have to pay me compensation for the damage instead. It was more significant than anything that I had ever felt before.
It was the 17th of July, just past 7 p.m. Andy was devastated. His mother, Pauline, had just broken the unfortunate news that his father had left her for someone else sexier. This meant that she no longer had a husband, and that more importantly to poor Andy, he no longer had a father. Throughout the rest of July, he struggled with depression and came extremely close to giving up. The realization that he had lost the father figure that had always been exceptionally important to him was finally kicking in. All those fond memories of their time together suddenly flooded him. That one time they were fishing, Andy fell in the lake because the fish overpowered him. Thrashing at football, and all those times his father came home drunk and became violent. In Andy's mind, these drunken fits of rage were always brushed off as occasional outbursts because of a stress-filled life. Due to his autism, Andy was vastly intelligent, and while he rightly took his autism in stride and correctly viewed it as a strength rather than a weakness, it had always led to two significant problems. The first was not being able to pick up on certain things, which is why he never realized until now that his father was a violent and selfish man. Secondly, he suffered from social anxiety, and difficulty with making friends plagued him. He admired many people and shared similar interests, but ultimately struggled to connect with them because of how shy and overwhelmed he could suddenly get. As a result of this, he was hit even harder by his father's actions, as he had no friends to rely on and be comforted by. Andy's mother, Pauline, was aware of this, and despite her being upset, she bought Andy an invaluable gift to try and comfort him in any way possible: a laptop. Her reasoning was not only to ensure that Andy had something to occupy his time and prevent boredom, but it was also a new way for him to find friends and socialize online. She hoped communicating online would help him feel less shy when approaching people, and it seemed to initially take away the immense pain he was experiencing, which was great. He quickly created an Instagram, Facebook, and Discord page to meet new people. All was seemingly swimmingly, but people began to laugh at him and send hateful messages because of who he was. Andy had never owned a laptop before, so he didn't know what he was doing. This led to situations like him messaging his mother, but accidentally sending these messages into open posts and public forums, leading to humiliation. Things worsened when he told these people about his new idea for a fledgling startup project. "You'll never achieve anything, you absolute fucking cretin. Not in a trillion years. Might as well quit while you're ahead. It saves you wasting your time and us laughing when you fail." These horrible, offensive, spiteful insults were hurled at Andy, shaking him to his core. This deeply affected Andy so much. As a result, he ended up spending August in isolation. However, this could benefit him as it provided vital time to work on something. Fueled by the anguish that he still felt because of his father, he worked hard on creating a program to simulate human behavior. Why did he do this? He wanted to ensure that in the future, he wouldn't have to suffer from bullying or missing a cue, because using his program, getting to know people and reading their emotions and thoughts would be a lot easier. December 1st rolled around, and Andy was starting to communicate with more and more people. He took the newfound knowledge from previous experiences with people online, and now made sure to send his mom messages more privately. He tried to find interests in people similar to his, and created engaging and meaningful conversations out of them. He noted these topics of interest and other aspects of the individuals, and put them into his algorithm. Based on the results, he'd know whether they were compatible with him, which was reassuring. To the shock of Andy and Pauline, the program had grown rapidly in popularity over the past few months, and Andy became rich and famous as a result of this just within a few months. His dad caught wind of this and wanted to become a part of their lives again, but they weren't gullible or stupid. Far from it. In fact, ironically, Pauline ran her husband through the algorithm, and even it determined that he was completely unreliable. Andy's father tried his best to worm his way back in, but Pauline and Andy were fed up with these desperate and pitiful cries, so they moved away to a new address so they would no longer need to be disturbed. The flights were booked, and Edinburgh, Scotland, was set firmly in their sights. The most exciting aspect of this was similar for Andy and his mother. Andy had a friend called Levi on Discord and lived in Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is quite close, whereas his mom had a handsome man named Rodriguez. while managing the algorithm for company, Andy. He just so happened to live in Edinburgh again. It was now mid-December and everything was great. Andy and his mom were living thanks to the immense success of the program comfortably. Although it was a cold December's Eve, Andy felt like shopping and exploring Edinburgh, which was still relatively unfamiliar to him. It was a frigid night, the city barren and ominous. As the snow began to fall and the trees glistened, he was starstruck. An excellent sight was gracing his eyes. Among the trees was a little gift shop with intriguing and aesthetically appealing lights illuminating its exterior. He was so intrigued by these lights that he strolled up to the shop and looked into the front window. It turned out to be a pawn shop. Andy had been looking for Christmas gifts, so he thought it'd be at least worth a punt to browse this shop. Knocking the door several times, he noticed a slight, frail silhouette slowly making its way to the door. "How can I help you, young man?" passionately spoke the elderly gentleman. Andy explained he was looking for a nice Christmas gift. The gentleman led him to the technology section and the assortment of phones. He had amassed quite a collection of brand new phones. "I'll take a few, kind sir." He smiled at the gentleman as he knew what he would ask next. "How many is a few, young man?" Andy continued to smile, thinking of the happiness that this would bring. 173, please." A few days later, and it was the 26th of December, 2018. Christmas had come and gone. Pauline had met a new man called Dan while he was working as their business manager. He proposed to her on Christmas Day. While Andy was initially quite skeptical, he passed the reliability test, the only evidence needed to prove that Dan was perfect for Pauline. Being in such a positive mood, due to the thought of him and his mom finally being truly happy again, he started to wrap up the 173 iPhones. As bizarre as it sounds, this number wasn't random. Andy had noted every person that previously said kind things, stuck up for him, and was overall a good friend to him. Now that he was living comfortably, successfully, he wanted to spread a little Christmas cheer and give something back to the people who genuinely cared. Luckily, the iPhone boxes were only so small that he could fit all 173 into his mom's car boot, and they drove to the post office together. They were all sent off to be delivered to multiple addresses. To show this appreciation for his true friends, he wrote a heartwarming message on the back of each of the 173 parcels. It read, "To my best friend from the unknown, I hope this gift brings you some happiness. If so, I will be happy." He originally intended for the parcel to be anonymous. Giving back was all that mattered to him personally. Them knowing about it was irrelevant. Unfortunately, though, Andy forgot to tell the post office this while providing the iPhone cases. Ultimately, his name and address were unintentionally plastered on the back of the parcels. It was now New Year's Day. Andy, his mother, and his new stepfather, Terry. He had just booked his holiday from work. A client was asking for numbers and book for his business accounts to be sorted out, but it was New Year's Day, and all that mattered to him was family. They were chatting amongst themselves until a knock at the door. They lived in rural Scotland. They had to drive 30 miles to reach the nearest post office, so a knock at the door, it wasn't heard of. Terry got up, curious as to who it was on the other side of the door. It was a courier with a parcel. It was from one of the addresses Andy sent an iPhone. It turned out to be the same package, unopened. Somehow the note had managed to stay firmly attached. It said, "Andy, you left your address visible, you donut. Thanks for the sweet message, though I don't want an iPhone. Being your friend is all I need. Love, Davina. P.S. I live nearby. Meet me at the old Hitchington Lake on the 5th of January at noon." He boarded the bus around 1 p.m., chilled and ready to meet Davina. As the bus drove, he noticed small cottages, a barrage of wildlife, and a surprisingly dry Scottish day. He loved the atmosphere, mainly striking ambience that was somewhat comforting. The bus arrived at 1:30, which was good, as he wanted to practice his social skills and be prepared. Standing by the river, he noticed a partially broken swing. Usually he would stay clear of this, but he needed the confidence to speak to Davina, so he decided to live a little. It was fun at first, but then the rope dwindled, and within seconds it snapped, and he fell directly into the lake. When the fishing incident happened with his dad, he was okay, because he was with someone, but this time he was on his own. And swimming to safety wasn't an option, because he didn't know how to. It all seemed over, and just as he started to flail and struggle, a faint voice was audible. Suddenly, a young girl of a similar age to Andy dived into the river and grabbed him. She guided him out of the water and saved him. He was shaken, but he was still alive. "You saved me." "Andy, I told you to meet me by the river, not in the river." As if it were destiny, Davina and Andy quickly grew to like each other. Love at first sight. Andy endured a challenging year, but he had gained a new family against all of the seemingly impossible odds. Not one new addition, but two. Andrew shrinks into his hoodie as he walks into the cafeteria. It is noisy. Students have scattered around, some sitting, some walking around, and everybody is either in one group or the other. Paired off, 4 to 6 clique, cheerleaders, football jocks, debate group. Andrew stands at the entrance of the cafeteria and looks around. He had just transferred a week ago to Carmen High, and in that week he had been teased, made fun of, and called every name in the book about having diabetes, and humiliated in front of his whole class, all by a group of mean jocks, Chris, Nick, and Mason. He had only been in Carmen High for a week and hated every minute of it. He scanned the cafeteria once more, looking for, and at the same time, hoping not to see who he was looking for. When he was satisfied that they weren't there, he took a step in. He had barely taken 5 steps in when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Before he turned to see who it was, Andrew knew who it was and had started shaking in his pants. "Well, look what we have here. Drew the Shrew. So you finally grew the balls to eat in the cafeteria like a normal person." Chris, the leader of the group, and the one Andrew hated the most, said. He laughed. Nick and Mason joined in as they took his arm on both sides and lifted him high, carrying him to the nearest table. Andrew didn't bother to struggle as they effortlessly moved him. He knew what was coming. He had lived through it once, and all he wanted was for it to be over. He closed his eyes and imagined he was at home. In his bedroom, it was his heaven, the only place he ever truly loved in the whole world. However, no matter how desperately he wished he could shut it all out, Chris's voice rang loud and clear as he announced to the cafeteria, "Hear ye, hear ye. Before you stand sugar overload, weak knees, diabetically perfect Drew the Shrew. Give it up for him, you all." A tear leaked through Andrew's tightly shut eyelids as all the students laughed. Andrew hears his dad call out to him as he runs blindly into his room. After the show Chris, Nick, and Mason had put on in the cafeteria played out, the principal, Mrs. Gooding, came into the restaurant and dispelled it. She gave Chris, Nick, and Mason a week of detention, and she had turned to Andrew and asked him if he thought he could still handle the rest of the day. When he didn't reply, she saw how he was shaking. She had called Andrew's dad to come and pick him up. It wasn't until later Andrew learned that a student had gone to report to the principal. Andrew silently said a prayer for that student. He slammed the door to his room, dumped his backpack on the floor, and fell face down on his bed, letting all the tears he had held back loose. He hears his dad knocking on the door, asking if he is okay and if he wants to talk. Andrew ignores everything and just sobs into his pillow. After a while, when he realizes Andrew is not going to answer, his dad finally leaves. 5 hours later, at 6:18 p.m., Andrew finally gets up from his bed. He had dozed off somewhere between crying his eyes out and hating his life. He sits in his bed and looks around. The sun spilled into his room through a crack in the window, illuminating the room. He picks up his glasses from his nightstand, puts them on, and walks outside. He sees his dad sitting at the dining table, his reading glasses perched on his face as he peered at his laptop. The light from the sun that shone through the dining area windows washed over his head, lightening the shades of his hair. Andrew stands at the entrance and stares at his dad for a few seconds. For as long as Andrew could remember, he had always wished he could be more like his father, have a quarter of his strength, a pinch of his courage, and not be this weakling. On the good days, he hated the world for being so cruel to him. He hated the people in the world for being so mean to him. And sometimes he even hated the universe for casting the type of cruel fate he had on him. And on the evil days, he hated himself. His dad must have heard his thoughts somehow because he looked over at him. He slowly removed his glasses, concern evident in his voice. He asked, "Hey, how are you feeling?" Andrew hesitates and then walks into the dining area. He sits in the chair adjacent to his dad's and pours water from the pitcher on the table into a glass cup. He feels his father's eyes on him as he drinks. His dad waits for him to finish drinking, and then he asks, "Okay now?" Even though he wasn't anything but, Andrew nods. His dad also nods and clears his throat. "You want to talk about it?" he asks. Maybe it was the fatigue from the day he had, or perhaps he was just tired of keeping it all in. But the automatic response he always had prepared didn't suffice at the moment, and he found himself laying it all out to his dad. He broke down and told him everything, from the humiliation to the embarrassments, the fundamental injustice, and everything he had been going through since he started going to Carmen. His dad listened while he talked, not once interrupting him, and when Andrew was finally done, his throat had gone scratchy, and the back of his eyes were itchy. The tears were threatening, but he did his best to keep them in check. He was not going to cry in front of his dad. He knew it was all right if he did, but he needed not to. When it looked like Andrew was finally done, his father said, "I want to tell you a story about a crow and an eagle. There was this eagle who got picked on by a crow, kind of like how you are getting picked on by these boys. The crow would fly above this eagle and peck on the eagle's eyes, kind of like how these boys act, air above you and pick on your sickness. And the crow, after doing this, would fly far away where the eagle cannot reach her, kind of like how these boys walk around feeling full of themselves after picking on you. But then the eagle does something. She flies straight and high, higher than the crow can reach, and because of this, the crow falls to her death, as she does not have the required oxygen to fly that high." At this point, his dad pauses and looks into Andrew's eyes. He holds eye contact with him as he adds, "And that, son, is what you must do. The eagle is what you must become. You must soar high, higher than those boys. You must fly, son, higher than those boys. So high they don't have enough oxygen to meet up. You must be the eagle, son." 20 years later, the rain pours down heavily. It had not let down since morning. It was 2 p.m. A black Chevy pulls up in front of a modern-style house. A man dressed in a black suit comes out of the car, runs towards the other side of the car, holds an umbrella, and opens the door. A man of the same age comes out of the vehicle, and the two both walk into the house. When they get to the entrance, the man holding the umbrella rushes forward to open the door for the other man. The house's interior is Andrew's childhood home. And as the two men enter the house, Andrew's dad comes into view. Andrew is the man who the other man, Nick, was holding an umbrella over. Behind them, another man about the same age as Andrew and Nick, Mason, rushes in from the pouring rain. He is the chauffeur who drove Andrew over. He was soaking wet as he stood in the entrance, not quite in the house, nor outside in the rain either. Andrew stands in front of his father and they stare at each other. Unsaid things and shared memories whisper between them. The rain continues to pour down on the roof in heavy droplets. The sounds of their platters, the only sound that can be heard above the heads as Andrew and his father stand facing each other. Andrew breaks the silence. "Hello, Dad," he says, his voice thick with emotion. His dad's eyes shone with unshed tears. Just then, another man rushes in the rain, soaking wet. He stands on the threshold and tries to shake the water away from his hair. even as he tries to protect the papers he had in his right hand from falling. He rushes into the living room where Andrew and his dad are. He awkwardly fumbles to the right as he stands beside Andrew. Andrew barely glances at him as he walks towards his father. They hug tightly, then they let go and sit on opposite chairs, facing each other. "So how are you?" "Work. I feel it's been forever since I saw you last." Andrew's dad said. Andrew chuckles and replies, "Yeah, I've missed you too, Dad. Work has been hectic and starting your own company is difficult, but I've been doing okay. And since it seems to be getting on its feet, I needed to see you. And so here I am." His dad nods his head slowly, smiling. "Well, I'm glad you did. It sometimes gets lonely around here, you know, and having my only son come visit me, well, this is easily the highlight of my week," Dad said. They both laugh. "And your diabetes? Do you have any episodes?" Andrew's dad asked, throwing one question after another, concern palpable in his voice. Andrew laughed softly and replied, "Relax, Dad. One at a time, please. Yes, I am taking my medication regularly. I am doing good on that front." Andrew paused, and his expression got serious as he continues. "I know what we went through with my diabetes, and wouldn't be so irresponsible to let that happen again. I have become even more careful, I promise. My medicine is here with me. It's with one of them." He tips his head towards the entrance where Chris stands. His dad's eyes follow Andrew's gestures. "Yes, I was going to ask, who are they? Should I offer them some tea?" Andrew smiled and replied, "Remember that story you told me about the crow and the eagle? How the crow would always pick on the eagle and fly away? Well," Andrew paused for dramatic effect as he points to Chris, Nick, and Mason. "These are the crows, Dad. Meet Chris, Nick, and Mason. The crows who flew away that day. The bullies who made my life a living hell in Carmen High." He stopped and looked straight into his dad's eyes, his voice firm with no trace of the tired little Andrew, who was constantly getting bullied. His eyes clear as he maintained eye contact. "I became the eagle, Dad. I became the eagle, and I soared high, higher than the crows could ever fly, and they fell." He continued, "That day, Dad, when I came home and you told me the story about the crow and the eagle, you gave me the courage to move on when I wanted to give up. And I am most glad I took your advice, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Thank you, Dad."